I never thought I'd be writing this down. Not out loud, not anywhere. But I'm near the end, and the weight won't let go. There's a truth I carried all these years that I've never spoken. I saved them. I saved the whole squad. And I can't tell you why or how I felt about it at the time. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was luck, maybe something else. I don't know anymore. What I do know is that no one else can remember me for it. And that's the part that eats at me. It was November 1944, near Metz, France d'Ardennes. The sky was slate gray and low, heavy with damp, and the air smelled of wet earth and burnt leaves. My boots squelched in the mud as I followed Lieutenant Harris down a narrow trail that wound along the edge of a shell-pocked orchard. The wind cut through the collars of our coats, and the guys, my guys, were quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you can barely hear yourself think. I kept my watch in my breast pocket that day. Nothing special, just a scratched-up Army-issue wristwatch, the kind that ticks too loudly if you're paying attention. But for me, it became a measure of everything. Waiting, moving, deciding. Every second seemed to stretch too long. Every minute carried the weight of the choice I didn't know I'd have to make. My closest companion, Tommy Jensen, trudged beside me, coughing against the damp, the edge of his scarf pulled over his mouth. We'd been through Normandy together, seen things we shouldn't have, joked about each other to keep our nerves steady. He was the one who could read my expressions without me speaking a word. I glanced at him as we approached the orchard. He gave me a tight nod, and I nodded back. Though neither of us said a thing about the tension, we both knew something felt off. Lieutenant Harris had a plan. He always had a plan. But that morning, I could see the strain behind his eyes. He barked orders with the same clipped authority, but it didn't quite reach the men. His hand rested on the map tucked under his arm, but his gaze flickered toward the orchard, like he expected trouble. I didn't need the map. Something in the air told me trouble was already here. Then I saw it, a glimmer behind a cluster of trees, small and almost harmless looking, but enough to make my stomach tighten. I felt my hand brush the tin cigarette case in my pocket, the one Tommy had given me back in Normandy. It wasn't for smoking. It was a good luck charm, a reminder of home, of simple, quiet normality. I fiddled with it absent-mindedly, the metal cold and smooth, trying to force my mind to slow down. That's when the order came from Harris, sharp and crisp. Sweep it. Move now. We all knew what that meant, and I hesitated. Just a fraction, but enough. And in that hesitation, I made a choice I couldn't explain then, and still can't justify now. Tommy noticed it, of course. He glanced at me, eyes narrowing, and I knew he was wondering what I was thinking. But I didn't tell him. I couldn't. I clenched my jaw and nodded, forcing my legs forward, but inside, I was tangled in a mess of fear, instinct, and something I can't name. By the time we reached the orchard, the sounds began. A faint rustling, too deliberate to be the wind. And then came a snap of twigs, and my stomach sank because I knew, without knowing exactly why, that what I was about to do would change everything. It might save them, or it might ruin us all. I held the cigarette tin in my pocket, the only thing grounding me. I remember feeling its weight against my fingers, and I told myself it was enough to keep me steady. But it wasn't. And whatever came next, well, it's why I'm writing this now, 70-odd years later, still haunted by the choice I made that morning, and the faces I can't unsee. Would you have done differently? I don't know if I would have. But I do know that the answer to that question is a burden I've carried longer than the war itself. And that's where it started. The moment I realized saving them wasn't simple. It wasn't noble. It was a decision I made without understanding the cost. And that cost, well, it's still with me. We broke camp before first light, the air still damp and tasting of cold rain. Harris kept his map tucked under his arm, eyes scanning every rise and hollow. The squad moved quietly, the mud dragging at our boots, every step measured. I kept my hand brushing the cigarette tin in my pocket, feeling the familiar weight, a strange mix of comfort and guilt. Tommy walked beside me, silent, his gaze shifting between the trail and me as if he could read my thoughts without asking. The next objective was a ridge beyond the village, a place we were told the Germans might have reinforced. Harris briefed us quickly, pointing to the faint contour lines on the map, his voice low and urgent. Stay tight, sweep slow, eyes open. That was all. No lectures about heroism, no promises of glory. Just orders, sharp and efficient. And underneath, I could hear the unspoken. Survive. We entered a thicket of low trees, branches clawing at our jackets. The ground was uneven, and every footfall threatened to give us away. I kept glancing at the tin in my pocket, feeling it press into my palm, reminding me that some things couldn't be ignored. Some debts couldn't be escaped. Then, it happened. A shout, a sudden flare of motion. A man tripped over a root, catching his rifle as it clanged against a rock. In that split second, I realized the ridge ahead wasn't empty. The Germans were waiting, hidden behind rocks and fallen timber, their rifles trained along the path. My stomach clenched. The trap wood skirted in the orchard now had a twin, and I could see every man in the squad stepping directly into it. I froze. Tommy glanced at me, and I caught the panic flicker in his eyes. I knew he saw the hesitation, the split-second calculus that had already begun in my head. Do I warn them? Do I act? Or do I didn't have time for philosophy. I acted. A sharp motion, a shout, a quick detour off the path. Tommy followed instinctively. We sprinted toward a fallen wall, the tin heavy in my pocket, grounding me. Behind us, the squad continued, unaware, moving into the line of fire we had glimpsed too late. The shots rang out, not close enough to touch us, but close enough to hammer our ears, to make my chest pound. Men yelled, and somewhere in the chaos, I heard Harris curse. My stomach twisted, knowing I had chosen to divert only us, only the two of us. I could justify it as instinct, as survival, but I knew better. When the firing stopped, the ridge was quiet, except for the shallow breaths of the survivors. A few men stumbled back, some bleeding, some shaken into silence. I kept the tin in my hand, feeling its weight, counting seconds that could never be returned. Tommy didn't speak. Neither did I. Later, as we regrouped, I saw the boy again. He emerged from the shadows of a nearby ruined farmhouse, eyes wide, clutching that same claw. I realized he had witnessed the aftermath, had seen the cost of choices no one asked him to understand. His gaze met mine, sharp, questioning, accusatory in a way that made my stomach twist. I wanted to speak, to explain, but words felt hollow. The tin pressed against my palm, a reminder that some confessions couldn't be shared with anyone. Not Harris, not Tommy, not even the boy. They were mine alone. And as night fell over the ridge, I knew that the choice I had made, the hesitation, the detour, the survival, wasn't over. The orchard, the trap, the men, everything from that morning was echoing forward. And I understood, fully for the first time, that some debts in war aren't measured in medals or promotions. They are measured in silence, in weight, in the cold press of a cigarette tin against your hand as you realize the cost of your own choices. The orchard was quieter than it should have been, the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. Leaves clung to the trees in soggy clusters, dripping onto our helmets and coats. Mud squished under every step, slow and stubborn. I remember thinking, this isn't just mud. It's waiting. Lieutenant Harris signaled for us to fan out. Tommy and I moved to the right flank, staying low. He kept his eyes sharp on mine, reading my hesitation like a book I didn't want him to finish. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself over and over that this was routine, that we'd done worse. But my hand never left the cigarette tin. It was a ridiculous little talisman, the kind a kid might cling to in the dark. But it gave me a thread of something I could hold on to while the rest of the world seemed to tilt sideways. Then I saw movement, a flash of brown and gray between two gnarled trees. My gut clenched, and I froze. Not fear exactly, more like recognition of a trap I couldn't name. Tommy whispered, "You see that?" I nodded. My mouth was dry. The wind carried a faint metallic smell, not blood yet, but close enough to make my stomach twist. Harris's voice cut through the fog of mud and leaves. "Check it. Clear it." I hesitated. Just a second. And in that second, I glimpsed the position we were walking into. Machine gun nests hidden behind fallen trunks. Rifles trained along the trail. My chest tightened, and I realized that moving forward meant leading the squad straight into it. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I felt Tommy's hand brush mine as he passed. A silent question I couldn't answer. I clenched my fist around the tin in my pocket. The metal was cold, heavy, real. I wanted it to remind me of home, but instead, it reminded me of my own cowardice, or maybe my instinct. I don't know which. And then it happened. A single shot rang out, sharp and deafening, though somehow muffled by the trees. Leaves rattled in panic. Tommy cursed under his breath. My heart leapt into my throat. The order from Harris came again, sharper this time. "Advance! Move!" I made the choice. I can't justify it. I can't even say it was bravery. I made a detour, a wide, careful loop around the line of fire. I signaled Tommy to follow, and he did, though I could see the confusion in his eyes. The squad pressed forward behind Harris, walking straight into the trap I'd skirted. I watched them disappear into the orchard, the mud sucking at their boots, their backs unaware of what waited for them. And in that moment I felt something. Relief, maybe. Guilt, certainly. Fear, of course. I don't even know what else, because it was all tangled together. Impossible to separate. Minutes later, the firefight broke out. Not close enough for me to see clearly. Just the staccato of gunfire and the occasional sharp yell. I crouched low, heart hammering, listening. The smell of wet earth was sharp, almost metallic now. My hand never left the tin. Tommy whispered, "We're not supposed to just sit here." "I know," I muttered. I didn't look at him. Couldn't. By the time Harris and the others staggered back, the orchard was littered with confusion. Men shouting, a couple limping, others pale and silent. And I realized then that my detour had done something. It had spared the two of us from being in the line of fire, yes. But I hadn't saved anyone else. I hadn't warned them, hadn't acted to prevent the trap. My choice had been selfish, calculated, and silent. Tommy didn't speak for a long time. He kept glancing at me, reading what I couldn't say. I kept my eyes on the cigarette tin, letting its weight ground me. But the guilt was already seeping in, like water into soaked boots. I didn't know yet what it would cost me. Not then, not ever. And that's when I noticed him. A French civilian, peeking from the edge of the orchard. Eyes wide, clutching something small in cloth wrap. I can't explain why he startled me more than the bullets. Maybe it was the innocence. The reminder that there were people outside the war who didn't ask for our choices. Maybe it was because I knew that whatever decision I'd just made would ripple beyond us. I didn't speak to him. I couldn't. I only saw his eyes. and they saw me. And in that look, I felt the first tug of the question I've been wrestling with for decades. Was following orders the same as being innocent? The orchard went quiet again. The smell of wet earth lingered. My hand was still on the tin, and I knew, without wanting to, that the cost of that small, selfish choice had only just begun. The days after the ridge bled together. Fog, mud, and the quiet hum of exhaustion wrapped around us like a shroud. We moved from one ruined village to another, sometimes finding temporary shelter in barns or abandoned homes. Harris kept his eyes sharp, but even he seemed worn, the crispness in his orders fraying at the edges. Tommy never left my side, and I could feel him watching me, waiting for the slip I didn't dare make. The tin was always there in my pocket, heavy against my fingers. I traced its scratches absent-mindedly as we trudged, letting the cold metal remind me that I was still here, still breathing, still carrying the secret that no one else could know. It had become a kind of measure of time, too. Each day, each hour, a reminder that my choice in the orchard and on the ridge had real consequences. One evening, we took shelter in a farmhouse that smelled of smoke and rotting hay. The squad huddled in the main room, checking rifles, cleaning gear, nursing bruises. Harris stepped outside, muttering under his breath, leaving Tommy and me alone. I pulled the tin from my pocket and rolled it in my hand, thinking about the men who hadn't been so lucky. The ones who faced fire because I had hesitated. You ever wonder, Tommy said quietly, why some of us make it and some don't? I didn't answer. Couldn't. The weight of the orchard, the ridge, the decisions, it was all too close. I thought about the boy in the orchard, the one who had watched without speaking. I thought about the squad, the lives that hung by a thread because I had acted, or not acted. My hand closed over the tin. Then came the sound. A faint shuffle from upstairs, almost imperceptible over the wind, rattling the shutters. I froze. Tommy tensed. We moved toward the staircase slowly, rifles raised. At the top, in the shadow of the loft, stood the boy. He didn't speak. He didn't run. He just looked at us, eyes wide, and held up the cloth. I wanted to tell him something. Anything. But what could I say? That I had chosen my survival over theirs? That I had skirted the fire and sent the rest into it? That I didn't know why I had done it, even then? Words felt like lies, even if spoken honestly. Tommy lowered his rifle slightly, sensing my paralysis. The boy made a small motion, a gesture I couldn't read, and then vanished into the darkness. We never saw him again, but that glimpse stayed with me, sharper than the sound of gunfire, heavier than mud in my boots. That night, sleep was impossible. I kept turning the tin over and over, feeling its weight as if it could somehow hold the past together. I thought about the orchard, the ridge, and the faces of the men I had saved, and the ones I hadn't. The moral ledger of that morning, the hesitation, the detour, was still unsettled, and I could feel it pressing down on me, whispering in every quiet moment, "You made a choice. Now live with it." By dawn, I realized that survival wasn't the point. The point was the cost, the reckoning, the way a single moment, one hesitation, one decision, could stretch across decades, shaping the man I would become. And I understood fully that the orchard wasn't behind me. It was in every step, in every glance, in every tick of that tin against my palm. We moved out of the orchard just as the sun began to struggle through the gray clouds, turning the mud to a dull, wet sheen. Harris was quiet, which was worse than any shouting. He muttered orders under his breath, checking his men like a man counting the cost of something he didn't yet understand. I kept my hand on the cigarette tin, feeling its cold metal press into my palm, and tried to keep my breathing even. Tommy stayed close, his eyes darting around. always back to me. He didn't ask, but I knew he wondered what I was thinking, what I had done. The squad was shaken. A few men limped, some had grazes, and a couple went pale at the sound of every snapping twig. I couldn't stop thinking about the ones I'd sent straight into the orchard, into the trap I'd skirt. I'd told myself I hadn't known exactly where the nests were. I told myself it was instinct, survival, but I could feel the truth pressing through, like a damp glove inside my chest. I'd acted for myself. We crossed a shattered bridge over a muddy stream, water rushing under the broken planks. I paused, looking down at my reflection in the dark water, and for a brief second, I didn't recognize the man staring back. Mud on his boots, grime on his hands, fear etched into every line of his face. And that tin in my pocket, cold, familiar, reminded me that I'd carried more than my own weight through the war. I'd carried a secret too. Tommy finally spoke. "You think Harris saw what we did?" His voice was low, almost lost in the wind. I didn't answer. I couldn't. We set up a temporary bivouac near the stream, the rest of the squad patching up minor wounds. Harris went off to check the perimeter, leaving me and Tommy alone by a fallen tree. I pulled out the tin, opening it carefully, and let my fingers trace the scratches along the lid. Inside were 2 cigarettes, dry, wrinkled, useless, but they were more than that. They were a reminder of home, of something ordinary in a world gone sideways. "I can't stop thinking about them," Tommy said quietly. He meant the squad, the ones who had faced the ambush. I understood. I was thinking the same thing, only I couldn't say it aloud, because the truth was mine alone. Night came with a biting wind that seeped through our coats. Harris called us to attention, insisting we keep watch, but sleep was thin. Every snapping twig, every distant murmur, made my stomach twist. I kept the tin in my hand under my coat, feeling it like a lifeline. It was strange, carrying it through the war. And yet it had become the one thing that grounded me when everything else seemed untethered. Then I heard the first whispers of trouble, men murmuring about what had happened in the orchard. A private swore he saw Harris give me a long look, the kind that feels like it weighs your life in his hand. My stomach sank. Did he know? Could he tell? The thought made my hands shake. I couldn't sleep. I kept turning the tin over and over, thinking of the choices I'd made that morning. I kept hearing the snap of twigs, imagining them as shots, imagining the consequences that had yet to unfold. I couldn't tell Tommy, not yet, and I couldn't tell anyone else. Some truths are too heavy for conversation. Some weigh too much even for a journal. And then there was the boy, the French civilian from the orchard. I hadn't seen him since that first glance, but I couldn't get him out of my mind. What had he seen? Did he know that I'd chosen a path that spared me while letting others take the hit? That glance was a mirror I wasn't ready to face, and I wondered if I ever would be. I realized even then that this war wasn't about glory. It wasn't about medals or newsreels. It was about the small decisions, the ones no one records, the ones that leave you awake at night with your hand on a tin cigarette case, wondering what kind of man you really are. By the time dawn threatened the horizon, I knew one thing with grim certainty. I couldn't ignore what I had done. The choice I'd made in the orchard wasn't behind me. It was waiting, and sooner or later, it would demand its reckoning. The air was sharp and wet as we crested the hill that overlooked the valley. Morning fog lingered like a shroud, dulling the colors of the broken landscape. The squad moved slowly, every step measured. I kept my hand in my pocket, fingers brushing the tin, feeling its cold weight as a rhythm against the tension in my chest. Tommy walked beside me, silent, watching both the valley and me. I knew he wondered if I'd freeze again, if I'd make the same choice I'd made in the orchard. We spotted movement below. A small patrol of German soldiers, routine reconnaissance, but enough to halt our advance. Harris signaled for silence. Men crouched, rifles ready. I could feel the panic bubbling beneath the surface of calm. I had faced this before. The split-second decision between action and hesitation. But the stakes felt sharper now. The consequences personal. "Tommy," I whispered, "if I make a move, follow my lead. Trust me." He nodded, eyes searching mine. There was trust there, yes, but also doubt. I couldn't blame him. I couldn't blame myself either. Not yet. The patrol moved closer, unaware of our presence. I watched their formation, noting the gaps, the slow turns of their heads, the ease with which they overlooked the ridge. My hand clenched the tin in my pocket. It was absurd. Comfort in a war zone. A childhood relic pressed against my palm. But it was the only anchor I had left. I made the choice. Not for glory, not for honor, not for anyone else. I acted because hesitation would mean repeating the orchard, repeating the ridge, letting instinct overtake reason, and letting men pay for my fear. I signaled Tommy and we slipped down the ridge, silent, moving like shadows. Every step carried a weight, every breath a measure of what we owed. When we were close enough, I tossed a small rock toward a distant tree. The sound was enough to draw the patrol's attention, and they moved as a unit, rifles raised. That was the moment. I knew the risk. Tommy and I advanced, using the cover of trees, slowing the soldiers' approach, creating just enough confusion. The men behind us, our squad, seized the opportunity. Shots rang out, sharp and precise. By the time it was over, the patrol was neutralized. Our squad regrouped, shaken but intact. Harris gave a curt nod, his face unreadable. I kept the tin in my pocket, feeling it press against my fingers. It had been my measure through all of this, through hesitation, survival, action. And yet, even as the relief washed over me, the weight of choice didn't lift. Tommy clapped me on the shoulder. That worked," he said, voice low. Relief, pride, disbelief. I nodded, but inside, I was thinking of the orchard, of the men we hadn't saved, of the boy who had watched and vanished, and of every moment in between where my hesitation had shaped outcomes I still couldn't justify. As we moved to higher ground, I realized something I hadn't dared admit. The orchard, the ridge, the choices, the hesitation. They weren't just behind me. They were inside me, shaping every action, every glance, every instinct. The tin pressed against my palm, a cold, relentless reminder that some debts are carried forever. And that's when I understood. I hadn't just survived the war. I had survived myself. But the cost? Oh, the cost was something no medal, no commendation could ever repay. The next morning, fog rolled in thick, clinging to the treetops and turning the world into a gray blur. We moved cautiously through the fields, mud sucking at our boots, rifles ready. Harris was unusually quiet, checking every bend, every shadow. I kept my hand on the tin, feeling the cold press against my palm, and I realized how much it had become a measure of my conscience. Tommy stayed beside me, but even he seemed tense. Not the usual tight-lipped tension from combat, but something heavier, like he sensed the weight I carried but didn't yet understand. We followed the rest of the squad toward a farm on the edge of the village, a place the intelligence officer claimed might provide shelter for the night. The farm was abandoned, shutters hanging loose, barn doors swinging with the wind. The smell of decay was sharp, mingling with wet earth and the faint scent of smoke from a nearby chimney. As we entered, I noticed signs of recent life. A half-full bucket of water, a broken chair, a tattered cloth, That might have been a child's blanket. That's when the memory of the boy, the French civilian, hit me again. Harris ordered the men to set up a perimeter. While they did, I wandered toward the barn, the tin still in my pocket. I peeked inside and found a stack of firewood and a small loft above. I thought about climbing up, thinking maybe I'd find a moment's solitude. But then I heard whispers, quiet, deliberate, coming from the edge of the yard. It was him, the boy. He stood by the remnants of a well, clutching the cloth from before. I froze, unsure whether to approach or retreat. He didn't run. He didn't make a sound, just watched, his eyes wide, curious and wary. I wanted to speak, to explain, to apologize, but the words stuck in my throat. Tommy joined me then, his eyes tracking the boy. "You think he saw us in the orchard?" he asked softly. I didn't answer. Couldn't. Because I knew what I'd done. The choice to skirt the trap, to save myself while leaving the others to face the fire. And now, the boy's eyes seemed to hold a quiet accusation, a mirror I wasn't ready to face. The squad settled in for the day, Harris moving among them, checking their wounds, issuing small tasks. I stayed close to Tommy, trying to appear calm. But every glance toward the boy made my stomach tighten. The tin pressed in my pocket, heavy and real, as if reminding me that my secret had a shape, a weight. By mid-afternoon, we heard the distant rumble of artillery. Not close, but close enough to keep everyone on edge. Harris barked for silence and urged us to stay low. I felt Tommy's shoulder brush mine, a small anchor in the tension. I realized then that this day, like every day since the orchard, would demand choices. Choices that could define or destroy us. And I wasn't sure which path I'd taken yet. Night fell again with the fog rolling back in. The boy was gone by then, vanished into the shadows, and I wondered if he would ever forget the sight of us, the Americans in mud-stained coats, carrying our rifles and our secrets. I wondered if he would ever understand why we acted the way we did, or if he would just remember fear and survival, like I would. I couldn't stop thinking about the orchard, about the men who had faced the ambush, and about the moment I chose a detour. My hand went to the tin again, tracing its scratches, feeling the metal bite into my fingers. Every time I did, I remembered the choice, the hesitation, and the whisper of something I couldn't name. And as the wind howled through the broken shutters, I realized something else. The orchard hadn't finished with me. Not by a long shot. Whatever reckoning waited for me, it was coming. And I knew, deep down, that the cost of that morning, the choice I made, was far from over. Years later, long after the mud, the gunfire and the fog, I still feel that morning in the orchard. I see it in the faces of men who survived, in the faces of the ones who didn't, and I feel it in the tin, a small, scratched-up piece of metal that has outlived all of us. I hold it now in my hands, thinking about what I did, about the choices I made, and about the men who trusted me, whether I deserved it or not. After the ridge, we continued the campaign, moving from one shattered village to another, always forward, always tense. I never spoke of the orchard, never confessed to Harris, never explained to Tommy. There was no reason to. The war didn't need my explanations, but I carried the weight in every step. Each time we faced fire, I felt the echo of my hesitation, the memory of those I had left exposed. Tommy and I made it back to the States together, though many of the squad didn't. We tried to live ordinary lives afterward. Jobs, families, quiet routine. But the orchard never left me. Sometimes in the night, I would hear the snap of twigs, smell the wet earth, feel the weight of that tin pressing into my palm. It wasn't fear. It was memory. the memory of a choice that could not be erased, of a moral ledger that demanded repayment in silence. I think often of the boy, the French civilian I glimpsed, who vanished into the orchard shadows. I've never known what became of him. Did he survive the war? Did he remember us? Did he know, even in part, what I had done? That uncertainty gnaws at me more than any enemy fire ever could. I never told my wife, never told my children. Some truths, I realized, are too heavy for love to carry. But I write this now because I can't carry it any longer. Because survival isn't just about living. It's about reckoning. And 70 years later, I need someone, anyone, to know. The orchard was never a place on a map. It was the space where I learned the cost of choice, the shape of fear, and the weight of silence. I saved them. I survived. But I did it in a way that haunts me still. The tin rests on my bedside table now, a cold, permanent reminder that some decisions, made in mud, fear, and instinct, cast shadows long after the guns have gone silent. Would you have done differently? I don't know. I can't answer that. All I know is that the orchard waits for every man who has made a choice in war. And some of us carry that orchard inside us forever.